Hey there, welcome to Board Game Hot Takes, the podcast where we give our immediate reactions to the hottest board games just minutes after playing them. My name's Tim.
This is Adam.
And I'm Chris.
We're going to depart from our normal format for this episode, and instead of a hot take review, we're going to discuss what makes a board game fun to us. We also have the designers of the hot new Stegmaier game, Red Rising, Jamey Stegmaier and Alex Schmidt on our show to talk about the game.
Before we get started, we wanted to remind you that we're giving away a copy of Frosthaven when the Kickstarter delivers. To get an entry, all you have to do is follow us on Twitter at BG_HotTakes or on Facebook at BoardGameHotTakes, and you can get 2 additional entries if you leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you do leave us a review, send an email over to Tim. His email address is tim@BoardGameHotTakes.com. Or drop us a message on social media and tell us the name you used so Tim can mark you down for your extra entries. Now let's get on with the show.
Jamey Stegmaier is the founder of Stegmaier Games and the designer of several popular games, including Scythe, Viticulture, and Tapestry. He's joining us, along with his co-designer Alex Schmidt, to talk about their upcoming game release based on the Pierce Brown novel of the same name, Red Rising. Jamey and Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to talk with you today about your upcoming game, Red Rising. Can you start off by giving us a brief description of the game and what it's all about?
Sure. Alex, why don't you go ahead? You don't often get to do this, so I'll let you do more of the talking today. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so Red Rising is, well, first and foremost, it is based off of the books by Pierce Brown. And as a game, it is a hand management game. The gameplay is inspired by fantasy realms, where on your turn, you are playing a card, and then you are picking up a different card off of the table. And each of those, the card you play is going to have an effect on the game, and the card you pick up, where you pick it up from, is going to have another effect. And it's all about creating combos out of that.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And if any listeners are interested in reading more about the game and the design process, you can find Jamey and Alex's design diaries on the Stegmaier website. We'll try to ask some questions today that aren't already covered there. So Adam, go ahead and kick us off.
Hey guys, Adam here. Thanks for coming on the show today. My first question for you guys is, what is it about the books that captivated you, and how does that translate into the gameplay?
Well, I heard about the books many years ago. Alex read them a little bit more recently. I loved a lot about the books. I love dystopian fiction, and I thought the books presented a very interesting type of dystopia where the society of Red Rising has been divided into kind of genetically engineered castes. It's kind of a caste-based society based on colors. It's not the same as the color of our skin in the real world, but it is an allegory to that. So it does look at some of the issues regarding race in the real world too, as all great speculative fiction does. So I love that part of it. It also just has a great story, a great plot. And the thing that really elevated it was, for me, the relationships between the characters, the personalities of the characters, and the tough choices that they have to make, including some really tough leadership decisions that a number of characters have to make throughout the series. So that is what elevates it for me, that really hooked me into the series and made me want to design a game around the concept.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't actually read it until after Jamey brought me in to think about working on the game with him. And so I was reading it from the perspective of someone who is looking to design a game here. But the Pierce really did an amazing job of taking each character and having them be a person who has some good qualities, some bad qualities. Whether they're a hero or a villain in the portrayal of the books, ultimately they are a character who struggles, and even the good guys are not always good.
Have any of you read the books?
Yeah, Jamey, actually a few years ago or a couple years ago when you mentioned you were looking to design the series, I had overheard one of your interviews, so I picked him up and really enjoyed him, and I've recommended him to several other friends. And in fact, just recently, Chris started reading him on my recommendation, and this was right before you made the announcement about the game. I thought it might be coming based on some past hints that you'd given. So I was like, this is a perfect time for you to pick it up. You should see what you think.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I did, and I've been loving it. Yeah, I've been loving the books. They've been great. And actually, Jamey, I had a follow-up question for you about that. Mm-hmm. Going back and getting ready for the interview, I was looking at all the games you've designed and published, and I was kind of looking for themes, and a very clear one emerged. You got Scythe and Euphoria, now you got Red Rising, and that dystopia is definitely, it seems like your thing, and you had mentioned that, but what is it about dystopia that draws you in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I hadn't quite thought about Scythe in that way, but Scythe is, it's at least an alternate reality, an alternate version of our universe. I don't exactly know. I just love dystopian fiction. I love fiction that takes our world to the extreme in some interesting way. Because I think it's, like I mentioned with Red Rising, it's kind of it often ends up being kind of a lesson about things that we can learn about our world and the choices that we make in real life if we go a little bit too far with some of those choices. But also, I think one of the fun things about dystopias, and this is hard to say, but all dystopias seem to start out with a utopia in mind. Like whoever designed these dystopias didn't go into it saying, I want to make a terrible world. They had some ideal that they thought would make the world a better place, and it just didn't work out that way. And I just find that an interesting hook for fiction or game design.
Yeah, it's interesting.
All right, great. And now with Red Rising specifically, I was looking at what you've indicated the weight of the game, may be, and kind of looking at the gameplay, and it seems a little bit lighter than some of your other designs. And I was curious, I know it's based on Fantasy Realms, which is a very much a kind of a filler game. It's a very small, light game. But did the weight of the game, was that kind of driven, did that come just organically, or was that driven by your intention that you're potentially getting fans of the books into this game and you wanted to give something that was going to be a little bit easier for them, more accessible for them to get to? Was that a conscious choice?
Yeah, Alex, why don't you jump in here and I'll piggyback off you.
Yeah, absolutely. This one, it was very definitely a conscious choice. I think some of the early designs that Jamey worked towards, and he can talk about that more, but there's this desire to catch the entirety of this world, and as a giant dystopian sci-fi world, you can imagine like a Twilight Imperium type game. And not only is that not exactly a Stegmaier game, but that's not the kind of game that would be friendly for people who know the books. And like, it may be what they think they want, but if people who are not necessarily gamers, if they were to try to start, learn a game like that, that could be overwhelming. Versus, what we came up with is intentionally something that's friendly for anyone who is new to gaming. I will say, in a very early playtest, the hand size was 7 cards, the same as Fantasy Realms. And I really liked it that way personally, but it wasn't the right decision for the game, for the weight of the game, because there was just too much complexity added right at the start of the game that way.
It still fits into the model, like the kind of the model for Stegmaier games are that we try to make event games. We don't make games that you have to plan a weekend around, but we also don't make games that you can play in 15, 20 minutes. Between Two Cities is the one exception to that, but that was kind of before we decided this is what we wanted to do as a company for all of our games. And so Red Rising, we probably could have, like what Alex just said, we could have made it a 10 to 15 minute, very light game, and that would probably have been even more inviting to pure Red Rising fans who aren't gamers, but that didn't fit into the Stegmaier mold. So we ended up with a game that plays in around 45 minutes, a little longer or a little shorter, but depending on player count. And so it still kind of is in that event game category. And I found playing with Megan here that we often play 2 games back to back because it doesn't take that much time, and it's the type of game where you finish and you're like, oh, okay, at least for me, I want to play again right away. And so when we get back to the days of game nights, people will be able to play it back to back if they want to at one game night.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. Makes sense. Now, just a quick follow-up on that. Obviously, you just finished this design, and I know you had been working on a Red Rising design for a little while. If this is successful, do you see another future tabletop game in the Red Rising world? Do you think you would go with something with a more epic scope if that happened, or is that future and you'll just turn that corner when you get to it?
I would consider it. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to close the door to more games in the Red Rising world if depending on how this game is received and what people hope for the future. And we definitely don't have anything in the works.
Okay.
But I'm open to it, especially since when I kind of planted that seed a couple of years ago for other designers to submit games to us. I know some designers submitted some great games, and others might still be working on them. So it's possible we'll get a submission in a year that we're just like, oh, wow, this is such a cool game. It's a lot bigger than what we thought, but we can't resist it. So it's possible, yeah.
Whether it's us or someone else, the Red Rising universe is big enough. There's enough going along. There's enough depth that there is space for any number of different games set in that universe if that were to happen.
Great. So, Jamey, I was watching the YouTube video, I believe it's from April 2018, on how you failed to make a design for a Red Rising board game. Were any of those designs close to coming to fruition? And then, as a follow-up to that, with a failed design, what do you do with a failed design? Does it go away? Do you kind of table it and maybe bring it back later? Have you ever designed a completed board game from a failed design? If you could speak to that,
Yeah.
I'd like to hear it.
For those early designs, I learned from every game that I designed that doesn't end up becoming a reality. And I learned, a lot from iterations of games. Like the early versions of Scythe are very, very different than the final version of what Scythe became. But the early versions of Red Rising were just very different than what we ended up with. They were mostly worker placement games. There was, I believe, at least one bag building iteration. They all used meeples of all 14 colors found in the Red Rising world. And it just, I couldn't juggle that many abilities. And often the scope was too big. It was kind of a player sitting down, looking down at this world of Red Rising, looking down at this universe. And it didn't feel like you were really immersed in that world. So there are mechanisms, especially bag building. I learned a lot about bag building during that process that might come up in a future game, but none of it ended up really directly contributing to the final design that Alex and I came up with.
Yeah, and it seems like the characters really are kind of at the core. I mean, like any good story, the characters are really what's at the core of it. So I can appreciate how you'd want to incorporate as much of that as you can. But that actually leads to a question. I'd like to dig into mechanics a little bit. I am a huge sucker for theme. The more heavily themed a game is, I just absolutely love it. And so one of my favorite things in a game is when you've got a theme and a mechanism that kind of come together nicely in some kind of a clever way. Like a couple of examples, Wingspan has a great example. I love the fact that you have a predatory bird can eat another bird. You draw the card, but it has to be the right size bird. Obviously, an eagle is not going to eat a great blue heron, for example. Or in Scythe, where if you start combat in a space where you've got civilians living, you're going to drop in popularity. So the mechanisms and the theme kind of come together in a great way. And I wanted to hear from both of you guys if there are, give a couple of examples that you really like about Red Rising, where the theme and a player ability or a card ability or a faction ability kind of plays into that.
Alex, do you want to share one? Maybe a lot of them are based on different colors in the game. So, Alex, do you have maybe a color that you want to mention? And I'll mention one of my favorites.
Yeah, my first thought was actually a specific card, and that's Cassius. Okay. Cassius doesn't like to be with Darrow unless he is also with Mustang. Like it's subtle, but it gives you that sense of a story that's present there, even though you're not getting the story itself in the card play.
One other kind of example like that are the Obsidians. The Obsidians are the kind of the brutish assassins of the world of Red Rising. And I just wrote about them today in today's design diary, so they're fresh on my mind. But one of the things the Obsidians do, when you deploy them, almost every Obsidian banishes the card that they're placed on top of. So they're essentially, even though you can get banished cards back, they're essentially killing a character in the game, because that's often what Obsidians in the world do. You tell your Obsidian assassin to go take out one of an opposing faction's character or something like that. So that we kind of looked at every color in that way and said, what does this color feel like? What do they do? And how can we represent that mechanically in the game?
That's awesome.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah. No, I want to talk a little bit about the production, because you've mentioned now you're going to be releasing a retail version and a deluxe version of the game. And I don't know if you've shared all the details in the deluxe version, but you've shown some of them in the design diary so far. And there's one feature that actually stood out to me, because just a couple weeks ago, our group was chatting about how it's surprising that there isn't foil cards in a lot of modern tabletop board games. Like that's been around in collectible card games and Magic the Gathering for years, and it's a nice premium feature. What inspired you to add that to Red Rising? Was it from something like Magic the Gathering, or have you seen other board games that did something similar?
Well, I'll speak to this a little bit, and Alex has an interesting perspective based on the company that he worked for before Stegmaier Games. I play Magic, and I love foil cards in Magic. And I wanted something like the golds in Red Rising, the gold characters. There are more of them in the game than any other character, because there are more. The books kind of focus on these characters. They're the elite of the world, and so I just wanted something to make those cards stand out and feel extra special. And foil came to mind pretty early for that. And part of that stemmed from Magic. Another part of it, and I'll let Alex chime in here, is that Alex worked for a company called Greater Than Games that makes Sentinels of the Multiverse.
Okay.
And they have some foil cards that are really beautiful. And I think it may have come up perhaps in a conversation about those cards when we decided to put foil in Red Rising.
So I guess two things. First, with Greater Than Games and Sentinels of the Multiverse, basically with sort of the culminating expansion, they released a fifth anniversary set of foil character cards. So all the cards that are in front of you all the time in that game have the foil if you get that version. It's the same as the previous cards, but with the foil and slightly different art. And that's been fairly popular. I don't think it would be as popular with that game with the cards that are just shuffled into your deck, because they only come up every once in a while. Yeah. But that's worked pretty well. I would say the one struggle with modern games versus modern games, CCGs or LCGs or TCGs or whatever you want to call them, they have like the randomness to them. So if you get a foil card, it's something special. Versus if I'm buying Red Rising or I'm buying Sentinels or I'm buying any Fantasy Flight living card game, you know exactly what cards you're getting in the box, and so it doesn't have quite the same effect because there's not the rarity assigned to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, was the cost to manufacture those prohibitive in any way that would prevent you from putting them in future publishes on a regular basis, or do you just think it's something you would only want to include when it's special like that?
I would definitely want it to stay special, but it's not all that cost prohibitive. It's a little bit graphic. Like, it takes more effort for graphic design. You have to create more layers to send to the manufacturer, and there are also different types of foil. Like, the type of foil in Red Rising is a little textured. You can kind of rub your finger over it and feel it a little bit, versus a type of foil that's more just kind of integrated into the background of the card, makes it shiny. I think that's a little less expensive. But it is something that we could include, and I would actually love to include it in future games too, if it makes a certain type of card feel special.
Yeah. Okay, great. Sounds good. All right, we just have one last round of questions here, so Adam, go ahead and jump in.
That sounds so appealing, that foil with the textured. Yeah. I just want to put my hands on that card and get a hold of it. That sounds so nice. Mm-hmm. And that's funny with the cats too. Tim's cat is always trying to get airtime, so that's yeah. So my next question, I'm going to broaden the scope a little bit, but I want to hear about specifically Red Rising too. What is the most difficult part of game design to overcome? Or, in other words, when do you know you have a successful idea or project on hand? So if you give me the broad scope answer, and then how you knew with Red Rising when that moment happened.
Yeah, it's a big question, and Alex, I know you have a little anecdote that I cut from your design diary post, so maybe you can mention that about our first playtest at Dewey's. Part of it for me, I mean, a big part of it is, I play these games a lot. If we're thinking about publishing a game, whether I'm the designer or the developer, and there's always a moment when I'm going through this process, or there always is or isn't a moment where I realize that I am just having fun with the game. And sometimes that doesn't come. Sometimes that moment never comes, and we end up not publishing it. Because even though my fun is subjective, as the person who is publishing the game, I need to say this game is actually fun, that I am having fun with this game. And usually with a prototype, it takes a while for it to get to that point. With Red Rising, it came really early. Once we figured out this connection to fantasy realms and how we can make this work. And that's the anecdote that I'm hoping Alex shares here. But that was a big part of it that's a big part of it for any game, but for Red Rising in particular. It was nice to have that happen so early in the process, because after attempting like 4 previous designs, if we hadn't hit that pretty early, I may have given up on it again and just let it be.
That's got to be such an incredible moment to realize, to have that breakthrough and be like, this is it, we got it, this is what we want. It's got to be so nice.
Yeah, especially after we spent a lot of time on it. Yeah. Alex, do you know the story that I'm talking about?
Yeah, so it was, we sat down for the first playtest with Jamey's business partner, Alan, who's also the co-designer of Viticulture. And we sat down at Dewey's Pizza, which is a local pizza place. I actually used to work there. And we played through this like very first prototype. And normally the first prototype you play it and something breaks, you usually don't get through the game at all. And it just like, even just explaining the rules to Alan, he immediately was like, Jamey, this is the simplest, like, I understand the rules of this game. I've never had this happen for the first prototype, where like you tell me the rules and it just makes sense. And then we just played through it and it worked. That is not normal. That's never happened for any, like, this is my first published game, but I've designed other games and that's never happened with any of those. And from what I've heard from Jamey, that's very unusual for him as well.
Yeah, all of my other first play tests are terrible. Yeah. But this one was not, yeah.
With the other half of the question, I would say the hardest thing for me personally, at least as a new designer, is knowing when it's finished. Like, and whether that's when is it good enough to take to a publisher, because a publisher is going to want to change it slightly to fit with what they want for the game, or as if you're, self-publishing, when are you done? There's always like little tweaks you can do. And so I've really enjoyed working with Jamey for that, because my co-designer in this case is also the publisher. So that's his problem.
Great,
Nice.
thanks.
Now, Chris, I'm going to interrupt you because I know you're going to jump into a question, but I want to follow up since Alex was just chatting about his involvement here. Now, Alex, being the co-designer on the Red Rising game, I also noticed that you recently became an employee of Stegmaier Games as of last year. Mm-hmm. I was just curious, did your involvement in Red Rising come out of your employment there, or vice versa, or were they unrelated? Was there something about working together on this game that, Jamey, you said, wow, Alex is a great fit for our team and I want to bring him in. How did that come about?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's unrelated, but it's not. Neither was a direct result of the other. Jamey and I have known each other since 2016, I think, and so we've been friends. I've been in his gaming group since then, and in late 2017, I started working for Greater Than Games, and the primary role I had there was to actually help Stegmaier. Greater Than Games does like warehousing and fulfillment for Stegmaier. And so my primary role was a liaison between the two companies, which worked great because I knew Paul and Christopher and the guys at Greater Than, as well as knowing Jamey. And so my working for Stegmaier Games was more of a natural progression of that.
Okay.
But that came out of me knowing Jamey, and us working on this design together also came out of me knowing Jamey. So they're related, but not direct.
Interesting. It's got to be convenient to have the co-designer, working for the same company. So your boss is also your co-designer. You can schedule time appropriately and things like that. Has that been a good working relationship for you?
For me, yeah, definitely, yeah. It'll be interesting to navigate moving forward, because I enjoyed working with Alex so much on this co-design that I want to design more games with Alex in the future. But we also have to make sure that we're getting our core jobs done. Like, my core job is running Stegmaier Games. Alex's core job is as a director of sales. So we almost have to find time in our spare time to do this design work. But also, as I have to respect Alex's time in many different ways through that process, because he does a lot as director of sales, but he's also fun to design with. It's tough it'll be tough to balance going forward, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah. Jamey, made the mistake of hiring me and giving me a slightly higher workload than I had before, so I have slightly less free time.
Yeah.
All right, Chris, why don't we jump in with the last question here?
Yeah, so I wanted to wrap up by inviting you to daydream a little bit here, and without giving away any future plans or anything. If you guys, and this is for each of you, if you were the king of the world and had the opportunity to work a game with any intellectual property that you could, what would it be?
I'm curious about Alex's answer, because for me it's like Red Rising was the answer. It has been the answer for that question for so long that I don't have another one. The closest I can say is that there are certain world builders that I would love to work with on new IPs. One is like Jakob Brzezowski, how he created this world of Scythe, and we kind of built it together through the game. And that was exciting for me to see the popularity for his 1920 plus world grow thanks to Scythe and vice versa. And there are a few other artists like that I think are really, really good world builders that I would love to build worlds with through game design. But I'm very curious about what Alex will say here, because he hasn't had this dream of Red Rising in his head since 2014.
I would say there are a couple. It's hard to come down to just one. The obvious one for me is Brandon Sanderson. Like anything Brandon Sanderson. Like, there have been a few games that are based on his IPs, but there's nothing that's sort of like and in some ways that's actually closer to Red Rising. There's nothing that's like a comprehensive, here is this world, here's an experience of this world. And he makes such compelling worlds that it would be very satisfying to do a game like that. But then there's just a few like video game worlds. Like I played Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2, the MMOs, back through like in college especially, and there's a really cool world there, and that would be really fun to bring into some kind of tabletop experience as well.
Can I throw that question right back at you guys before we close out? You want to throw out an IP real quick that you'd love to see us make a game in that world?
Uh-huh.
If you have a second.
I grew up with, I've always been a huge Star Wars fan, so that's an easy one for me. And obviously there have been Star Wars games done. I think none of them have really been, exactly fun games to me, the Star Wars games that are out there. There's some solid ones, but nothing that's quite, I think what Stegmaier, the model that you use and the type of fun you add to your games, I think there could be a really awesome game in there. That would probably be an ideal for me. It's an easy one. That's an easy one to hit out of the park. What about you guys, Chris or Adam?
So I'll jump in while Chris is thinking. I am really into the world of The Expanse, the books, and there's a TV show. But you talk about allegorical stories. There's so much there to explore, and it's a near future sci-fi, which is a theme that resonates with me. So I'd like to see more development on The Expanse. There already is an Expanse board game, which is really good, but I think there's so much more to explore and develop in that world, and I would love to see more material on The Expanse.
I love that book series. Yeah.
What do you got, Chris?
Chris, you have one?
For me, I'd have to say, it's funny because I hadn't even thought of this answer, but it popped into my head, and I'm like, that would be great. Aerosmith. I don't know if there are any games out there based on rock and roll bands, but maybe that's a niche that needs to be filled.
That's awesome.
Why Aerosmith specifically, Chris? What pops out for you that would make?
I don't know. It just seems like that would lend itself to a game. I don't know.
Funny. All right, great. Well, how and where can listeners purchase Red Rising? When is it going to be available, and where can they get it?
Yeah, so the pre-order will be in early March. We don't have an exact date yet. Probably March 3rd, maybe March 10th, early March. And then the game is already on the boats headed to fulfillment centers now. So we plan on shipping it to pre-order customers in late March, early April.
Okay, great. And once, if they don't pre-order it and it's going to retail, do you know what retailers may carry it, or just any local game store, anywhere specific you would send people?
Yeah, it'll be available through distributors worldwide and through the retailers that they serve, and that'll be a few months after our pre-order date, probably late May, early June.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
And do you know when it's expected to be available on Tabletopia or any other online platforms due to the current situation?
It'll be available on Tabletopia right before the pre-order, a few days before the pre-order, so people can try it out and see if it's something they want to buy a tabletop version of. And then we are working with Board Game Arena to get it on there, and we probably have a digital, we haven't signed the contract yet, but we have a digital partner for a full AI digital version as well.
Okay,
So,
fantastic. Yeah. Well, good luck with the release, you guys. Yeah. We're really excited to try it out, and we'll definitely be trying out the digital version as soon as we can, and we'll talk about it on the show and give our thoughts. But thanks again for joining us. This was great.
Yeah,
thanks for your time. Nice to meet
thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Hi guys, Adam here. As we move into this next segment, I want to give you guys a little bit of warning about Chris's audio. It's not the cleanest. I tried to clean it up as best as I could, but I didn't do the greatest of jobs, so I apologize for that. I tried to give the highest production quality that I can do. I'm not an expert by any means, but I want to give your ears a warning, and I want to urge you to listen to what he's saying and not necessarily how it sounds. So be warned. I think the content's really great. Again, I apologize for the audio on Chris's side. We're working hard to give you our best product. Hope you enjoy.
All right, let's talk about fun. Specifically, let's talk about fun in board games. Each of us is going to discuss a few specific elements of board games that we find particularly fun, and we'll provide some examples of games that have that element. So this is a topic that I think is going to be really interesting because everybody seems to have their own taste. Board games is no exception. And I find there are some games that I really love that maybe you're not that hot on. You'll still play it with me. Same thing goes the other way. Some of the games that you guys really love, it's your favorites, they don't necessarily get me as excited. And we have some different things that we're looking for in the experience of a board gamer that really makes it exciting for us. So that's why we brought up this topic. Now, this was Adam's suggestion, and this actually came up one night. I think it was after the Capital Lux review, if I remember right. But I think, Adam was kind of saying, Chris, really didn't like Capital Lux, but Adam had enjoyed it. And he was saying, sometimes we should talk about what actually makes games fun for us because, we just don't always agree. So I think it's a pretty interesting topic. I'm curious, how did you guys come about making this list? Was it a hard one for you? And what did you do? This is not as easy to quantify as some of the other things we've done.
This was a fun kind of homework exercise for me. So what I did, I looked at my favorite games and I wrote them down and I listed what I like about each of those games. And then I tried to go across those lists and look for common themes that lined up. And I was able to find 4 themes pretty easily. It was interesting to see what the crossovers were. And then there were some other games that had outliers. Like I enjoyed them for totally separate reasons than the rest of my others. It was, it took a little time and effort, but it was a fun kind of exploratory process for me.
What about you, Chris? How did you go about diagramming what makes a game fun?
Well, it's funny, not to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion for the podcast here, but I actually went back and listened to some of our old episodes and, kind of got that, that immediately after game response that we all had to the different games that we played. And I kind of listened for some themes, and they actually came out pretty frequently. And even, my own comments, it's funny because you go back and you listen to yourself, the things that you say, and you kind of get some themes out of that too. And you sometimes go, oh, wow, that's right. That is how I feel about it. I can sort of see a pattern emerging there. So going back and listening to some of that stuff again really helped me put together a list. And it ended up being pretty easy. It's pretty obvious stuff after I put a little bit of thought in.
How'd you come up with your list, Tim?
Yeah, when we started planning for this episode, like I always do, just thought about it over and over again for weeks. It was bouncing around in my head a lot and I couldn't settle on exactly what I wanted to say. I was finding different things and, different elements matched different games that I love, but I wasn't really working out. So I finally had to put it down on paper. I had to start just kind of brainstorming on paper a few things that I like, and then I could match up with some games and find what ones were the right fit. So it was actually quite challenging for me. And it was also hard because there's a lot I find, fun about games. It was not easy for me to settle on just a handful of topics, but I probably could have gone on and on about it. So I did try to pick a few things that I maybe did the same things you did, as I found a couple of my favorite games and just thought about what made them fun for me and then linked those to other games and stuff like that. But there was one common thread that I found throughout my lists here. Well, you know what? I'll circle back to that after the end. Let's talk through what we find fun about games, and I want to kind of bounce back on what I find as a common theme. Before we actually get into our list, I'd like to give you guys a chance to take a guess at what your other hosts think are fun about games. Chris, why don't we start with you? If you had to take a guess, and let's see how well you know us, what's one of the things that you think Adam is looking for in a game, or what he really finds fun, and what's one of the things that I find fun?
Wow, that's interesting. It's okay. So for Adam, I see an interesting juxtaposition between the fact that he buys a lot of these big, incredibly complex games with, like 100 pages worth of instructions and like oodles of pieces and a game board that you can't even fit on a dining room table. And he doesn't actually seem to like those that much. He'll tell us about the game he got, but I don't think I'm ever actually going to play it. With Adam, I'm going to go out on a limb and say something that moves quickly, something that's got some kind of rhythm to it and has some some flow, but isn't incredibly complex. For you, I'm going to say, and I say that, and you go back a second. I don't mean like you like simple games. I mean, something that it's more about the flow and the movement of the game than about the complexity. Complex games that flow smoothly. But for Tim, I'm going to say big boxes full of small arcane tokens, like tiny little bits. Tiny little bits with no cohesive, indicia of anything on them. You have to figure out places to put them on a lark. No, I'm half joking there. I know you love Euros. I know you love very complex resource manipulation, and I think I'm going to say it's almost the opposite. That complexity is a very interesting thing for you.
Interesting. All right, well, I guess we'll see if you're right. Let me jump in here, and I'm going to take a stab at you guys. I'm going to say Chris cares about how well the theme integrates with mechanics more than anything else. I think that if Chris is playing a game where he feels like he is kind of doing the thing that the theme dictates, and you feel like you can be part of that experience. I think that's one of the things that really drives fun for you. So that's my guess for Chris. For Adam, I think one of the things that he loves about games is he loves a big stand up and cheer moment. He likes when there's combat, when there's like you can beat somebody down, when you can roll the dice and see what happens, and everybody is standing around the table waiting to see where things are going. I think that's what Adam's looking for. He wants that experience in his games, and that makes it fun for him. That's my guess. What about you, Adam? What are you thinking that we're how we feel about games?
Interesting guesses, you guys. Very interesting. Tim, I feel like he's always like, oh, you guys are always getting in my way doing this and doing that. I think one of the things he likes about games is a game with an ability that he can make a plan and execute. He doesn't like people coming in and scrapping over his stuff and ruining his ideas. He wants to be able to solve the puzzle and work his way through the puzzle. So that's one for Tim. And then also thinking back on some of the comments Tim makes, he likes a smooth user interface, one where the iconography all makes sense. He's always like talking about UI and the iconography doesn't even make sense here. So I think those are some of Tim's key points. Chris, I felt like it was easy. He puts it out there what he likes and what he doesn't like. Theme. He's all about the theme. Usually some kind of dark monsters fighting each other, scary theme. He doesn't care if the rulebook makes sense or not. Like Batman, Gotham City Chronicles, it could be the worst rulebook ever designed. As long as there's like cool characters and a dark theme and you can sort of play the game, Chris is going to love it. But then also Pan Am. He likes Pan Am so that's a little like oddball one. I guess the theme is there in Pan Am. And then I feel like Chris really likes that interaction aspect too. He wants to rub elbows, or not just rub elbows, but start kicking people and punching people in the face. So those are my 2 guesses for both of you guys there.
All right, sounds good. All right, well, Adam, why don't you start us off? What's one of the first things that you really love about, or that you find fun in games?
Okay, so this one is probably the driest. A rule set that's worth the end product. A rule set that if it's small and light, then great. Is the game worth it? Does a small and light rule set generate an awesome gameplay experience? Or even if the rulebook is a little thicker, like Eclipse Second Dawn for the Galaxy, a little bit bigger rulebook. But you know what? Those rules all make sense. You read through it once or twice, and then the rules get out of the way and let the gameplay happen. A couple games that don't fit this mold were Empires of the Void 2. So there's so many little edge kind of scenarios in that game and things that you're like, oh, well, I'm not sure exactly what happens now. Let me see if I can find this in the rulebook. And you're flipping around and you're spending 5-10 minutes looking up a rule and come up with a judging. And another game that didn't quite fit this scenario for me was On Mars. They say it's one of the most complex games out there. It's really not that complex. You can do this action and that will have ramifications to this action, and you combo stuff together. But the rules, they're just not intuitive. I wouldn't say they're complex, they're just not necessarily intuitive for what's happening in the game. So in On Mars, you can kind of build one building module next to another building module, or it can be exactly 2 spaces away in some cases, and then your rover can move here, but it can't stop here. It can pick this up, but it can't pick this up. You can't go back to On Mars without having to reference the rulebook and get back into it and spending a good 10-15 minute spin up if you haven't played it in like a month. Something like Eclipse or Innis, Dune Imperium, you get right back into it. It makes sense. It just flows.
Except not to Steve on Monday night.
Except not to Steve on Monday night. That's pretty funny. So that kind of goes into what Chris was saying, is that a game that flows and it's not choppy, it just cruises right along, and the rule set is helpful. It's not prohibitive in the rule set, that just kind of makes sense after 1 or 2 plays.
Yeah, I think that's a great choice, Adam. And when we were thinking about this list, this was one of the items that didn't make my list, but it was absolutely one of the ones that I wanted to put on my list. I couldn't fit everything I thought found fun in games, but truly, if there's a game that has a lot of fiddly edge cases, you have to go back and reference the rule book for it. I just am not finding that fun. This partially comes from not only not wanting to have to learn all of that and the pause in the gameplay to go and look up the rules, but just trying to teach new players a game. It's already a lot to take in. I like mid to heavyweight Euros. I want to teach people these games, and it's already frustrating for them to have to sit through a 15 minutes rules teach. if I have to stop and give them another 10 minutes of just little edge cases that might happen once in the game, that's just, it's not good. It's not a good experience. It's not a fun experience. And so I 100% agree with that. Clean, streamlined games are really an important part of making a game fun for me too. So that's a great pick.
And that's something that's kind of risen to prominence for me as we've been playing more and more of these games over the last year. I was just like, play anything when we first started hanging out and playing games. And then now I'm like, look at that rulebook, man. I don't know about that. So I'm a little more reluctant. Is the game going to be worth it? Like High Frontier, I spent 6 hours trying to just move a rocket from Earth to the moon, and I don't know if I did it right.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mentioned earlier in the episode when we were talking to Jamey Stegmaier about how I know this was a kind of a cop out easy answer, and I said that one of the IPs that I really loved is Star Wars. And honestly, the whole reason why I haven't really loved any of the Star Wars games that are out is that they're so full of unnecessarily complex rules and clunky rules. And I think that's just a Fantasy Flight issue. And they happen to have the license for Star Wars, but there just isn't like a clean, smooth game in that IP. And that's why I called it out. But yeah, that's a great one, and I love it. What about you, Chris?
I'm going to say player interaction. I think that is absolutely one of the things that when we have a great game night, a lot of times because it's a game that has a high degree of player interaction. And unfortunately, I think that lends itself a lot of times to the games that have significant combat. And in those situations, I mean, that is, that's about the epitome of, tension in game world, right? I mean, you're going head to head with somebody, you're starting to combat. And I like sort of love/hate that feeling of, a perfect example of this is Eclipse, where, like my heart starts thumping. We're getting ready to go into combat, and you're like, well, what's Adam going to roll? What am I going to roll? And it's like, and you get kind of ramped up, and then there's like this big, if you do great, or, it feels horrible if you don't. And you get the trash talking going around the table. And I mean, that makes for a fun game night. It's not the only thing that makes for a fun game night, obviously. I mean, you can have a game that's got a lot less interaction, something like a Wingspan or Parks. Just a couple of examples of games that I think really epitomize that. Eclipse is one of them. Another one is Cthulhu Wars, which we did a show on a while back. Absolutely one of my top games for combat and tension and player interaction. Blood Rage is another one. A lot of the games that feature big combat, I think, really kind of bring that aspect.
Nice. Yeah, I'm not surprised at all by that, and I will be actually kind of surprised. I mentioned that I thought that was one of Adam's things that made games fun too. So I'll be interested to hear if that comes up into Adam's list here.
I was going to say, I was saying about combat games. If you can think of one, I'd be curious to know if you guys have, particularly you, Adam, since you're bringing this up now. Are there any games you can think of that have that kind of intense interaction that don't get that interaction through combat?
Well, since we're talking about it, this player interaction piece is absolutely on my list. I think at least Tim guessed this. I think Chris guessed something similar to this. But I love the player interaction. Why go to a board game night just to stare down at your player board and not really look around at the table, unless you're Tim Doloff, and that's really what you like to do. Some examples of this, again, you brought it up, Chris. Eclipse is a great one. I like PAX Premier 2nd Edition for this one too. You have your tableau and your spies, and you can move your little spies around the tableau, and you also have the map up there, and you can manipulate your armies or your roads and take out other people's things. So not only the player interaction, but also kind of the player entanglement. So some games, I'll bring one up here in a second, if I do this, it's going to benefit myself and Steve, but it's going to hurt Tim and Chris. And do I want that to happen? Do I want to incentivize Steve to take this action, which maybe he'll hurt Tim later on, which will help me eventually be in a better position. A lot of these cube rail games are kind of like this. Irish Gauge is kind of like this. You have this entanglement aspect that's not necessarily a combat or direct roll the dice, punch somebody in the face. A lot of these cube rail games, there's this game 1841. It's one of these train games, high stock incentive, but there's also a map, and you're trying to connect these routes. You get entangled with these other players because you own part of their corporation. So their success also benefits your success to varying degrees. And you can sell their stock, and that hurts them, and it hurts everybody else who owns their stock. You go to the map in a train game, and that's kind of like the battlefield. You can token out routes. You can lay these tiles that just ruin somebody else's route. You can block out routes. This game, 1841, there's so much freedom and so many options in there that I really like that entanglement aspect. And it gets kind of messy, and you kind of have to, sift through the weeds to see what action is going to benefit you the most, or it's going to help some people out, it's going to hurt some people. So who do you want to help? Who do you want to incentivize? And that whole kind of messy entanglement is something it's pretty neat in that specific game.
All right, so you guys got me so wrong, because I'm going to jump in here and say that one of the things that I like, that I have fun in games, is games with frequent player interaction. But, and this is actually where Adam actually kind of got me right, but not in a way that will be mean or going to ruin a player's game. So I do like those moments of player interaction. They are fun. Sometimes for me, but I've seen it for everybody. If you're in one of these big dudes on a map games where you can go in, come into somebody's space, get a good dice roll, and they're basically knocked out of the game, that can be really frustrating too. So I don't love that, not just for the way I feel about it, but kind of going back to, if I'm bringing new people into a game, I want everybody at the table to be having fun. And I think this is a common theme that I kind of found in my situation, in my list. And that is that let everybody have a fun time through the whole game. Eclipse is a really fun game. It's a really excellent set of mechanisms, but someone can literally get removed, exterminated, completely eliminated from the game. And that's not a great next hour that they're sitting out of the game or sitting there with one ship and they have no chance of coming back. So I like player interaction. I don't like that direct eliminate another player and I'm targeting you. And that's the other thing too. I think sometimes that player interaction can result in, Chris saying like, man, I'm just pissed at Tim tonight, so I'm going to go in and I'm just going to attack Tim. Or, oh, Tim's won the last 2 games, so I'm going to go in and I'm just going to take Tim out. Or Chris, it's like a king-making situation. Like, those are areas of this intense player interaction that I like the big moments, the stand-up and sure moments, and see how things go. But I also think they can lead to some negative, kind of a negative experiences. So what I do like, though, is when there is a lot of player interaction, when it matters what other people are doing, and I have to work around that, but it's not directed. It's not going to stop me from doing my thing. I just have to kind of work with that puzzle. I've got a couple examples. First of all, worker placement as a Euro mechanism is really heavy player interaction. It may not seem that obvious, but it's always fun to me to watch, hey, I've got these 3 things I need to do in this turn. If somebody else has taken my spot, first I have to make that decision and say, I've got to take this one first because this is the most important thing for me. And if I don't take it, someone else could. So let me prioritize what I need to do. And if I do that first thing, I may not be able to get to do those other 2 things, and someone else can come in and take that. So that's player interaction, but that's kind of a generic, kind of a light one. So I'm going to give you guys a couple examples of more heavy player interaction that are not direct, mean, ruin a player's game type of interaction. Number 1, Dwellings of Eldervale is a recent Euro game with dice chucking. You can go in, take somebody's spot, roll dice. But the great thing about Dwellings is that you're just going to that territory to get what that territory gives you. And people recognize that. Yeah, you needed that resource. Yeah, you want to dwell there. You're not coming in just to ruin my game. You're not coming in there just because the only way to get points is to knock me out of the game. And if you get lucky, I may have a worse turn. I might not be able to do everything I wanted to do that round because you won that combat. So it's fun. It leads to those exciting moments, but I know I'm not being attacked. I know that I'm not attacking you and making you feel bad about the game, but we still have those fun moments in it. Another one, Dune Imperium. The combat, the conflict in Dune Imperium is an excellent example of this, because one of the only ways to get points in the game is to go into conflicts. Everybody can take the worker placement spots, play the cards to try to get some combat power, try to be successful in that conflict. And if you win, awesome. And it's usually a very exciting moment. Who's going to, turn over that intrigue card that gives them some extra combat power? Who's going to reveal at the end of the turn with more swords that are going to, have an impact there? But nobody's getting picked on. Everybody's just in there to win the conflict and do their thing. And so it results in great player interaction, exciting moments, and it's not mean. And then the last one, this is a game that we haven't talked about on the podcast yet, but it's one of my favorite, I would say, family plus level game. It's called Jamaica. And specifically the game, the way I like to play it is there's an expansion called The Crew that adds a little bit of fun engine building in there. But Jamaica is great. It's basically a race game. And instead of like rolling dice and moving around the board, you're playing cards and moving around the board. you have a few choices of what cards you're going to play, and that might dictate where you end. And if you end your turn on the same space as another ship, you're going to have a conflict, and it's a dice rolling conflict. So there's some luck involved with it. It's always exciting. You get there, we're going to roll the cannon dice and see who's going to win this combat. But I didn't go there to attack you. I went there because that's what the card said I could move to this turn. And if I win it, I take something from you. If I lose, you take something from me. It's impactful, it's fun, but nobody's left out of the game if they have a couple bad dice rolls. So those are a couple of great examples of games that I actually do like player interaction, and I like having to work around if somebody gets in my way, but not in a way where, you guys are going to gang up on me, or you're always going to pick on me, or, choose me to go after because I'm doing well in other places in the game. So kind of going right along with your concept there, a little bit of what Adam said, but the opposite of what he thought as far as player interaction.
So some pushback for like Eclipse, for instance. I think that's a great part of the game. I like the ability to be able to identify who you think is in the lead and to be able to kind of set yourself up and maybe take them down or rein them in a little bit. And I think that all ties into the gameplay where you have to design your ships and kind of set your position on the map in order to preserve your lead and be ready to defend it. Or, see that, all right, you're weak on this front, so maybe retreat here and try to go attack this guy while setting it up. So I think that is, I guess, everyone to each their own. Everyone has their own interaction that they like and don't like. That's one aspect I just really enjoy. Setting up those ships. I know it's going to come down to a dice roll at the end. And you've won these dice rolls before, and I've won them before. I think that's great.
Yeah, no, again, I think Eclipse is a really fun game, and I'm not saying it's not always, but I do think it can, I think sometimes it can be not fun. And especially it hasn't happened a whole lot in our group, but occasionally someone will build up their ship really quickly, and then when everyone's kind of still just doing that building piece of it, they'll go into a space and then take somebody's, basically whole armada out with a couple, with a strong ship and a lucky dice roll. And then that person has got to play the next 5 rounds, the next 2 hours, without really a chance. They have to pivot really hard, and maybe they can make something work, but they probably won't. I think that's the risk with a game like that, and some people really love it. That's just not fun to me, and I think it's not fun to watch other people go through that frustration for me. I think that's part of what it is. I would like everybody to be having fun at the table, and sometimes it's just not going to be fun for somebody that gets that negative interaction early.
I can totally get what you're saying, and I personally feel like it's that doesn't detract too much. Or I'm willing to take that risk with it, but I do get your point. And as you were saying that, I keep thinking back to this certain marriage of state that we had once. You married me to Tapestry, which meant that everything that I needed to do on the track that I had adopted, you got the benefit from, and I couldn't even complain about it because we're married. So what can I say?
That's totally different type of conflict, and you were not getting picked on at all, but but it created a memorable moment.
Marital conflict, man, that's still conflict.
Adam, I think that was kind of you covered your second topic here. So why don't we jump back to Chris? What's your second? What's the second thing that you find fun in games?
Interestingly, to me, it's one that we had talked with Jamey about in this same episode, and that is it's when effects of a game, when the rules of a game kind of play into the theme of the game. And a couple of good examples just to highlight them in Stegmaier games, because that was on my mind when I was thinking about this before the interview with Jamey. There is in Wingspan where you have a predatory bird can draw a bird card and eat that bird, but only if the bird is the right size. You can have a giant bird eating a giant bird. And actually another one, it came to mind just when you were talking about Rebellion, in that I agree with you, not the perfect game, but there's some things in there where they're just thematically so perfect. Like I believe there was a card where it's like your best buddy card or meeting an old friend card, where you have Lando Calrissian and you play this card and you get to bring in Han or Chewie or something like that. And it's just, you play that card and it doesn't feel like a random, just like, oh yeah, I'm playing down a card that's got an effect. It feels like you're playing a story. And I love to see that. And that really, to me, that kind of a rule where you can really make a rule interact with the story, I think is just sort of the epitome of immersive gaming.
Yeah, I totally agree on that, Chris. And, again, it wasn't on my list. And I also can find fun in games that are a little bit more abstracted if they're still interesting mechanisms. So that it's not the most important thing for me, not quite as much as it is for you. But I do love whenever I see that happen, whenever I see a mechanism that actually feels like it's, actually telling the story or it's playing into the theme, I like to call it out. I have a great time finding that. So it still creates a lot of fun experiences for me as well.
To piggyback on Star Wars Rebellion, I love that game, Chris. Tim and I were talking earlier about Star Wars IPs, and you mentioned Fantasy Flight, and their rulebooks are, even in Rebellion, the rulebooks are a little edge casey, and this might happen, and this might happen. But for Rebellion, I make an exception because I love the theme so much, and the cards work so well with the story of Star Wars, and it seems just to all flow. And yeah, it took maybe 4 or 5 plays to get them all down, but for the most part now, I know all those edge case rules, and they do all kind of make sense. I can snap them out really quick because they are, if not totally intuitive, you can, force intuitiveness, if that's even a thing. Rebellion was a good example there, Chris. I like that one.
Adam, has Sarah played Rebellion with you yet?
No, I haven't forced her into that.
Is she interested? Have you brought it up?
She's more of a Star Trek. I might look at, some of the Star Trek IPs that are out there. I heard there's a few good ones, but...
All right, so let me go into what I actually had as the first one on my list. And this is, I like when the game requires you to kind of evolve your strategy. And this goes, again, a little bit against what Adam was thinking. I don't want a game where I have to sit down at the beginning and plan out my whole game and it'll just flow. If I get lucky or, I just have the right tempo. I like that. I like to be able to plan, have some goals that I'm working towards. But I like when there's a tactical puzzle that you have to work around as well. I'll give you a great example. My first one is Underwater Cities. So Underwater Cities is a game where there are some goal cards that you guys are that everybody's racing for. You have your metropolises, you're trying to hit those bonuses. So you have some kind of general goals you're going for in the game. You want to build up a big city. You might think you know what you're going to do with it, but every turn you have 3 cards to play with. And depending on what color those cards are, they match with the different spaces on the board. And that is so much fun for me that every turn I draw a new card and then I get to think, okay, what's the best way I can use this? What's the best way I can abuse this card in the next turn or two and get a couple options or a couple actions that I can do? They'll probably help me head in the direction of my main strategy, but I have to work around what other people are doing. And this, I think, also leads back to worker placement, and Underwater Cities has that as well. But the idea that every time I don't know what actions are going to be available to me, so I just have to take my best shot and then work around it. Hey, they blocked all those spaces I was going to do this turn. Well, what else can I do? What's the next best thing for me to do, and kind of jump to that. So
Tim, I have a question for you in regards to your thinking, specifically with worker placement games. How much do you consider spaces that other players might need? How much do you hate worker place, and instead of hate drafting? How much do you I can see this space would benefit Chris so much, or that I have to put my guy here and take what might not be my optimal play, but it'll ruin his chances of getting this many points, that it might be the better play?
Yeah, I 100% do that if I'm playing with someone else that's really experienced with the game, that that likes that type of gameplay. I will pay attention and I'll know exactly what everybody else should be picking based on open information. If I'm playing with newer players, I will usually not. I want everyone to have a fun time at the table. I want people to feel like they can kind of accomplish their goal. So I'll do a space if it's necessary for me. I won't intentionally block people. And then there's a weight on that, right? You have to balance, is me blocking Adam more important than what I really wanted to do this turn? Or if I do that instead of this other thing, am I getting about the same benefit, but I can stop Adam from it? So I will definitely consider it when I'm in a serious competitive gameplay. If I'm playing the same game, if I'm playing Dune Imperium with you, Adam, at this point, we're 4 games in, I lost my last game to you, I will be blocking every space that you need if I know you need it. So that's the way I look at worker placement. It kind of depends on the audience I'm playing with. I think you really can do that, but sometimes it's at the risk of your own strategy. I'm usually typically playing to make sure that I'm optimizing and playing to win in a way. But, if that's the way to win, which is blocking somebody else, then I'll do it.
Cool.
So the next game that I wanted to mention here, I have a couple more examples just to kind of talk a little bit more about what that evolving tactical puzzle means to me. So Everdell is another great example. This is another game that we have not talked about on our podcast yet, but we will be because it's probably one of my top 5 games of all time. I love Everdell. And the main reason about that is the card play in it. You're going to start the game with 5 cards in your hand, and there's 8 cards in an open group that you can play off of. So there's 13 cards to pick from, and so you have to choose what resources you're going to try to get with your workers so that you can try to play some of those cards, but those are going to shift throughout the game. So there's a lot of that of just saying like, oh, that card came up. Is that more effective for me right now than this other card? But even on top of that, some of the cards combo off of each other. So if I play a construction, then I can play a critter for free off of it. And so if I see a critter come up that matches a construction that's out on the table, all of a sudden the card that I was trying to play out of my hand, I might completely shift that and say like, instead I'm going to grab this construction first so I can try to add that critter to it. And there's every turn just feels like a really fun puzzle to me. You definitely can have a strategy. You can, be planning longer term for what you're going to try to do. But I also like that a lot of the cards, you can kind of combo off of them. So I've got a card in play now that benefits from me doing this one action. So now I'm going to try to abuse that and do as much of that as I can. So that's another example of a game that it feels like every turn you kind of have to look at the field and rethink about what you should be doing optimally and go for it.
So I want to bring up a game that's fresh on Board Game Arena, designed by Tom Lehman, that we had the chance to play the other night, Tim. Res Arcana. How does this game fit into that category for you? Yeah,
I think it's a pretty good. I think it's a good example of it. We only had a couple plays of it, so I'll have to see if it lasts. It's definitely on the top of my mind at this point, and I had a great time with those couple of plays, and I want to play more of it. But I think it does do a lot of that. With that one specifically, every game, they're fairly short games, which is nice, but every game you have a different deck of 8 cards that you're playing with. So depending on the cards you have, that whole game, you kind of have to play tactically different than you would a previous game. And I like that too, even though it's evolving a little bit based on what cards you draw that turn. I like the fact that every game feels like a completely different puzzle that you kind of have to focus on. So yeah, I definitely think there's a link there, and that's part of why I found fun in it. The one last one I was just going to mention really quickly was Whistle Mountain, which is a fairly new game I've had a chance to play a few times and really loved. And that's similar to, in fact, this one probably more than any other game, and that every turn, what the other players do before it gets back to you, there might be new engines built out on the board, there might be new resource spaces on the scaffolding, there might be new engines to buy or new upgrades to buy. Like every time it gets back to you, there's a whole bunch of new choices and things that are going to happen from that. And I love just kind of shifting and getting to make those decisions every time. All right, let's go back to you now, Adam. What's your number 3?
This it's production. But what I mean by that, I like components that promote the gameplay and help players understand the gameplay. Along with that, I want to say, give me some beautiful art or quirky art or thematically appropriate art. All the games I've been talking about earlier fit into this mold. So Eclipse, PAX Premier, 2nd edition, the card art for Innis, I think is outstanding. I want, some components and some artwork that bring me into the gameplay and help me immerse myself. Baseball Highlights 2045, it's just a little 2-player. You're doing some drafting and some deck building. And the art in there is just kind of quirky and reminiscent of old-timey baseball, but there's like robots and cyborgs in there. So that's pretty fun. And the components of there are nothing special. There's the linen finished cards, which isn't anything unique these days. But you have these classic pawns that kind of are reminiscent of early board games like Trouble or something. But they're these wooden, just, little pawn-looking guys. And those are your base runners. And you put them out there on your little cardboard mat that's just really a baseball diamond. Something like that kind of fits this mold. It's not an outstanding production, but it's just so clean and nice. It has little pennants for each team that just kind of draw you in if you're a baseball fan.
I've been wanting to try that game. Have you just played that online, or do you have a physical copy of it?
I have both. So I have the physical copies. One of the first games I bought. It's a great little game. And then there's an app. I couldn't get the app to work. It allegedly works online. You can play cross-platform against other players, but I've tried it a few times, haven't been able to get it to work. And user error is certainly a possibility there, but I've tried it with some relatively smart dudes, and we haven't been able to get it to work. That's a great game.
Yeah, I'd love to try that one out sometime. Did you have some other examples of production that stood out to you other than Eclipse and Baseball Highlights?
Sure. So a game like Soul, which I know didn't hit necessarily with our group, Soul, Last Days of a Star, flying around these spaceships around the orbit of a star, and the map is just a huge bright star amongst the black backdrop of space. Energy is slowly dwindling down as these solar flares happen, and it's just like a ticking clock until this star explodes and goes supernova. Only one ship can escape. So that definitely brings me into the theme and the gameplay. You almost feel like you're adrift trying to make it work. You're up against incredible odds. So it gives you that desperation type sense to the game, and the whole theme is kind of simplistic like that. There's not a lot of bling or a lot of pizzazz. It's just very, very melancholy almost.
Yeah, that's got really cool, unique components though too. Even if it's not super, you said blingy, but to me, I've seen the physical production of that game, and it actually it stands out quite a bit. Like it definitely feels unique. So I can see that for sure. Yeah.
Right, it has table presence, but it's not like, say, okay, so some counter examples would be Tainted Grail, for instance. The production is amazing, but there's just, I don't know how many miniatures in there, and do those add to the gameplay?
Are you saying that you don't like the production on Tainted Grail, or it wouldn't make fun for you, or you just don't think that it?
Right, I think it's like too much. Like, do all those miniatures really help the gameplay? They're cool looking and they're pretty, but
Is it because you don't use them all, or?
yeah, most of them just sit there in the box. What are they for? Another counterexample would be like Dinosaur Island or Dinosaur World. It's beautiful art, and there's all of this stuff. With Dinosaur Island in particular, there's like all these meeples and all these metal coins and all this bright color, and so there's just so much stuff that gets passed around, and there's all these little tokens. There's little science lab guys and little cardboard chits going here, and little tracker little cubes doing this. So there's so much, it almost detracts. Like, I just want to play a game. I don't want to have to like mess around with all these little bits and stuff, and it's taking up all this table. What the heck's going on? Where's the game? I want to play the game. I don't want to mess around with all these little plastic cardboard pieces and stuff. Give me some game.
Chris, this has got to be one that was high on your list too, right? Did you think about components when you were thinking about fun in board games?
Yeah, I'm actually just going to jump on the Adam bandwagon on that one, and that'll be my third as well, because I agree with everything he just said. I mean, a really nice production doesn't necessarily make for a great game. You're like talking Tainted Grail, but nothing will bring me out of a game experience faster than a really bad production. So, for example, I have never heard anything but good things about Orleans as a game, but I just get enthusiastic about it because of the production, the space base. And we played that a couple times, and it's a fun game. I like the mechanisms, but I can't wipe those goofy, cartoony spaceships from my eyes. I mean, it just hurts. On the other hand, there's some games that just so lean into their theme through their art and through their components that it's glorious. I mean, I'm looking at Scythe behind you right now in your video screen, and I'm like, man, the art in that game is just absolutely amazing. You've got the humongous minis in Cthulhu Wars, where the size of these gigantic miniatures gives you a sense of the game that you're playing, and that's half the fun. Another Cthulhu, I'm going to throw two Cthulhu examples out there, and actually maybe this is the counter to Adam's comment about Tainted Grail, but there's huge boxes full of minis, and to me, I almost enjoy the fact that I've got this endless box of minis that I'm not using most of them at any one time, but I love the fact that next time I could pick an entirely new character with an entirely new set of cards and an entirely new player board and another mini and all that, and that adds to me that adds for fun. So I completely agree with that. I'm sure living up to all my stereotypes in this, but theme and art and production.
Chris, I want to ask you about Batman Gotham City Chronicles. I remember you showing us pictures of that, and it looks like there's just all kinds of miniatures in there, and they look rad. So how much do you use those miniatures in different scenarios, like different stories, and you kind of play those out? Are they all involved? How does the theme and the miniatures work into the game play for you for that game?
Exactly like you said, that for each scenario you bring out a different set of characters. But what that does is create a lot of scenarios that you can play, and I imagine you could play these endless rounds of games with this and all these different scenarios, and for each scenario you have a lot of options there. In fact, that would be when we eventually get back together again, that'd be a lot of fun to get a multiplayer game of that one going. Mostly because I thought at it every single time that we played it. But yeah, it's the volume of the production there, I think, does actually add something.
And then can you talk about something like, I know you like Pan Am a lot. How does the relatively minimalistic production of Pan Am work for you?
That's a good question. I think the answer to that is it's minimalist, but they did everything so right. I mean, the things they did do, they did well. I mean, I think you had commented at one point, Adam, that the map they used was reminiscent of the maps that actually would have been used at that time in the airline industry. And the places that you go and the art for the cards, it was all places that now you look at Beirut. Beirut's not a vacation destination, but back when the game was set, it was, and the art reflects that, and the selection of locations reflects that. And even just the little planes, the little planes aren't much, but they look cool and they get the job done, and they interact with the cool board and the cool cards and theme in just a really elegant and enjoyable.
Nice.
Yeah, right on. I agree. I love production. I think it really adds to a game. I'm not quite the same as you guys. If a game doesn't have a great production, like Orleans, you mentioned, Castles of Burgundy, I can still love the game. I can still find joy in them. Production definitely helps for me, but I get that, man. I think it's really important. I think it's something a lot of people are going to find fun in games with. Now the rule book and the extra fiddly rules that Batman Gotham City Chronicles definitely outweighs the pretty awesome production there.
It's hard to argue with that.
It's funny you mentioned like Castles of Burgundy, Tim, or Orleans. I think of Castles of Burgundy the same way. It's a game I never would have approached had you not brought it up. And it's, maybe I'm a superficial guy, I guess. I like something that looks good and shiny and pleasant. So, but playing the game, it's so good. It's so fun to play. So, yeah, I don't know why I have that bias, but I can't look beyond it. I guess I'm too shallow to look for the substance there.
I hear you, dude.
My third selection here is, I like games that give you that little dopamine hit. Games that give you a little regular, that you can find bonuses in, that, you did this thing and bam, I just got something special, and for some reason, when I have that happening in a gameplay, it just feels so fun to me. So I got a couple quick examples. We were just talking about Castles of Burgundy. I love Castles of Burgundy because, early in the game, if I fill up a section, I get an extra 10 points. If I place this type of building, I get to place another type of building. If I place this building, I get to get a building off the board. Almost everything you do in there, it's either giving you points or it's giving you an extra action. And sometimes you can chain those actions together. I did this action, I got this action, then I got to do this action. And I just love all those little things, those little combos that happen, that everything's just giving you a little, I got something done this turn. Another example that we've been talking about a lot lately, Rajas of the Ganges, the Dice Charmers. We played that online. I just picked up the physical production of it, and it's such a blast every single time. You can sit there and, you're just rolling dice and marking some things on a piece of paper, but it feels like you're getting so many rewards, and I get so excited playing that game. The last one I want to mention is Tapestry, and Tapestry kind of does the same thing. Like, it seems really simple rule set there. You move your action marker up one track on the board and do what it says. Sometimes you get to pay a little thing to get something else. But what do some of those actions do? I move up to a certain space. Oh, you get to increase a technology card. That gives you a bonus. That might let you move up another space. That's going to get you another bonus. And so sometimes you can have a turn there where you're doing like 5, 6, 7 things in a row. And they're just fun actions. They're fun things that are happening. So I just love those little elements of where, like, I did something and I got a reward for it. I know that they're playing with me. I know the game designers are just messing with my mind and feeding me that little hit of dopamine. I love it. I don't care. I don't care that they're playing with my emotions. It still makes me happy to play those games.
That's cool. That's great.
Did you guys find that any of your games, because I want to mention just a couple of ones I just mentioned here, did you find any of the games that you are calling out in these categories, were they easy to fit across a lot of your categories, or did a lot of them kind of get pigeonholed into this game is fun for this reason, this game's fun for a completely different reason?
I have an answer for this one. So the outlier for me, so the games I kind of looked at were Eclipse, Innis, Dune Imperium, Baseball Highlights, PAX Premier, and this 1841 game. I've been playing 1841 continuously asynchronously for about the past 6 months. And it's got this, so it takes a long time to play, maybe 2 weeks per game. It's a slow build up. It is kind of the outlier. I play it on an Excel spreadsheet, and I play it on an online implementation that's just a map with hexagons. And there's these, if you know anything about 18xx games, they're relatively dull production. There's circles and hexagons and black lines. a lot of math and calculation. So that's a game that I really, really enjoy, but it doesn't, quite fit into the mold, like the rule set. The rule book is, I don't know, 30 pages, and it's written like an aircraft manual or a car manual or some kind of legalese, and the production's not really there. The one things that are there are the player interaction and my last one, which I'm going to save for when we get to that.
Yeah, I was just curious about that because I found that with all of my categories, most of the games that I picked on this list would fit into any of the categories. That was for me, like I was consistently, hey, what are my top 3 games? Oh yeah, these are all the things I love about it. And then I create one of those categories and then find, half a dozen of my other top games are in that list, but they could also go on any of these other lists. So like with Tapestry, with Castles of Burgundy, either of those could have gone in, a couple of the other categories that I've already mentioned and another one that's upcoming. So I was just curious if you guys found that favorite games are just, they're finding fun across, across a bunch of different areas, or, are we leaning towards these games because because they hit a whole bunch of these marks, or is one of them good enough? Is a good production enough to make a game fun for you? Or does it also have to have a light rule set and be interactive and things like that? I kind of think that to make this type of list to be something that I consider a game that I find really fun and it comes to mind, it's probably hitting several things that I really care about.
So going back to 1841, the rule set is crazy, but within that rule set, you can, once you learn it, you can navigate within it and bend it to your will, and you can do so many things that once you've mastered that rule set, which admittedly takes a long time, but it's worth it to me what you get out of that game for what you put into it. So that kind of goes with that first rule set worth the gameplay product that comes out of it.
All right, sounds good. So Adam, why don't you just jump into what is your 4th and final category you've got here?
The 4th one, Chris nailed this one. I want an appropriate crescendo. So I want an end-game climax. I like a game that builds. Preferably, hopefully I'm, one of the last players that's duking it out for the title at the end of the game. But even if it's between two, all the other players and I'm like in dead last place, I want to see those dramatics. And I do want those like stand up and yes type moments, or I want to hear the groans and the cheers at the end of the game, because that's just fun, coming together and having those highs and lows. I love that. So you mentioned it, Tim, that final conflict in Dune. We've had so many close ones where bust out that last intrigue card and it's a no, and you win by 1 or 2 swords. And it's just like, it's so fun. That final combat in Eclipse, we've talked about a few times tonight, those dice rolls. And that's after you're building up your ships this whole game and sort of cat and mouse with, am I going to go into this hex? Is Chris going to come over here and wipe me out? It's just a nice build-up. And then Innis, you start with just, a few dudes out there and a few locations you can go to, and it slowly builds up until you have 6, 7 of your clan's members out. That sounds bad, but not clansmen. What do you want to call those guys? Help me out. Help me out before we get disbanded.
Friends. We'll call them friends.
We'll call them friends. People that just want to find a home in Ireland. So you get all your troops, all your dudes, all your friends out there on the map, and you're, instead of just little jabs, little sparring at the beginning, at the end of that game, you're throwing uppercut after uppercut. You have all these powerful, the red cards in your hand that you're dueling out, trying to battle for one of those win criteria. Soul is the same way. You're building up and trying to get these points before the sun goes supernova, and you know that it's counting down, and it's tense. You don't know if that next card that flips up is going to be the final solar flare and the whole thing's going to explode before you can get out of there. Games that get you on the edge of your seat is something I love.
I want to just mention that last turn in the Dune game we played on Monday night, and this game does always come to that last final conflict or last final moment in the game. In this game, I was 2 points up on Adam. I knew he's going to win the last combat. He had tons of forces in there last conflict, which was going to give him 2 more points. We're going to tie. He's sitting at zero spice. I've got 1 spice. I've got a way to get 3 more spice at the end. That's the tiebreaker. You win on spice. I'm like, he's going to get those last 2 points, but I don't think he can get me in tiebreakers. He busts out an intrigue card that I've never seen before, which is either worth 2 swords if you played in the game, or it just gives you 10 spice at the end of the game.
Oh,
Had no idea that was even a possibility. He won by a card that let him beat me on the tiebreaker as a hidden reveal. And I loved it. It was so cool. It was so cool because they actually put this card in there that the only usefulness for it at the end of the game is to bust a tiebreaker. But you have a use for it you can do elsewise. I think it was one of the most clever little pieces of design that I've ever seen in a board game to pull that out.
The name of the intrigue card is Tiebreaker.
Yes, it was so good. It was, but yes, do an Imperium. That's exactly one of the things that's so amazing about the games, that you start out slow. You know those early conflicts. Yeah, maybe you can get some Solari, maybe you'll get a spice, maybe you'll get 1 point, and then by the end of the game, the points are ramping up. Those conflicts matter more, and it usually almost every game has come down to the final turn and a tight match between at least 2 players, and it's always a blast. So that's a great one. All right, Chris, what about you? What's your number 4 thing that you find fun in board games?
My last one, I'm gonna maybe a little bit of a cop out, because really what it is, it's something that pulls a lot of these other things that I've been talking about. It pulls them together, and that's cohesiveness. And what I mean by that, to go back to the concept of immersion, it's that everything in the game works to pull you into the story of the game, and nothing kicks you out. That's a pretty high bar. I mean, when you think about it, because you kind of have to get everything right. And when you find that game that has almost everything, one little thing that kind of makes you go, it's sort of like when you're watching a movie and you see the sneaker of the guy in the monster suit, and it kind of takes you out of it. And so, for example, I'll give you an example. Played Dwellings of Eldervale. Amazing games. So much good stuff going on in there. Almost achieved that level, but there was, for me, the dwellings part. It's like, what? How did the dwellings become this big thing? Like, how it's almost like they had to find some way to work it in, because they put it in. It's or the games.
I didn't give you the flavor on the game, Chris. I'll explain that to you sometime. There is a point to it, but I get it.
Okay. Well, but yeah, I mean, it's. And then there's games where they throw the kitchen sink at you, where it's like it's like rule salad. They just make up stuff for the sake of complexity, but it doesn't add to the version of the game. It doesn't add to the theme. But then you have those games that really just succeed every way. I'm talking a lot about rules, but it's not just the rules. It's also the art and the production. You've got player interaction. That's great as well, and the theme. When those things all come together, it is absolutely magical. And just a couple of examples that I can think of. One of them is Parks. It's a relatively modest midweight game, but everything in it, from the art to the set to the production of it, the quality of the pieces, every little bit of it. I mean, I feel like I'm visiting a national park when I play this game. And that feeling is so amazing. And I find, at least for me, like nothing pulls me out of that. And once I'm in it, I'm in it. And Pan Am is actually another good example, which is funny because Adam had raised that as how can you love production that much and then have this game that has a modest production? But there's so much elegance that the pieces not necessarily being perfect, but everything is just right. It all fits together: art, the production. And to me, that kind of leads me back to sort of the holy grail of a game. That pull all the pieces together, you're able to mesh that with the theme. I absolutely.
Chris, I could not agree with you more. I think I kind of alluded to it with my little likes about games, but I didn't pinpoint it as well as you just did. I love that cohesion in a board game, and that's something I look for. It brings the game to life for me, really, when that happens. So, well said.
So, Chris, the whole story behind the Dwellings of Eldervale is that there is a new fantasy land that was discovered through a portal. Just like humans are wont to do, all these races have destroyed their current land, so you've got to get there and settle in this new place first. And so the whole point is to get there and build up your dwellings, build up your homes, and be the one who lives there and kind of succeeds the best at getting there and surviving. So hope that helps.
Tim, what about you? What is your final like?
Better be good.
It is good. It's better than anything else we've talked about today. The one other thing that I really, really love in games is, and then if I don't see this in a game, I generally do not enjoy it. And that is if there is a sense of progression in the game. A lot of this comes into engine building. So I'm going to give some really great examples of engine building games. But generally, if I don't feel like, if I play the first round of the game and I play the fourth round of the game and what I can do in that round and how the game feels is no different, that is usually a pretty big turnoff for me. I'm usually pretty bored with the fact that why did I just waste those first 3 rounds? I could have just played the fourth round and that was good enough. That's really important to me. I'm going to give you a couple examples. Terraforming Mars had to make this list because it is one of my favorite games. The sense of progression, the engine building there that I really love, that I don't see in a lot of games, is that income. Basically the buildup of income that happens over the game. So you've got these 6 little tracks on the board. You can track your money, which are like credits. You can track your steel production, your titanium production, thank you, plant production, and then like heat and energy, I think, right? Those are the 6. And so it's really cool. So if you manage to play a card in the game that lets you increase your production, then at the end of the round, you're going to get that amount of things. So throughout the game, you just have more capabilities to buy stuff, to build stuff, to put plants out in the field, to open up more cards that you can build. And I just think that that's a really fun way to do engine building. I know it's just cubes. I know it feels very mechanical, but I just love that, I definitely feel by the 5th, 6th round, I can do a lot more. I can have a lot more fun options than I could at the beginning of the game.
Talk about dopamine at the production phase of that game. You're getting in all these little cubes and put them in your tray and slide stuff over. It feels so good to do all that stuff.
Yeah, totally. And then there's also the fact that you are building up a tableau of cards. So you also are going to have more things you can do. So yeah, a few different elements there. What was that? What were you going to say, Chris?
Actually, I'm glad you brought up terraforming because, ironically, considering the production of that game is not the most exciting, that is one of the games that I would put into that category of they pulled so many things together in that game, so cohesively that I think it is one of those ones.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, totally. All right, another one I'm going to talk about is a game called Near and Far. It's a Ryan Lockett game, and Near and Far is an interesting little game because it is a Euro. It's got a little bit of a worker placement type of mechanism. But it's also a race game, and it's also an adventure game, and it's got a storybook. So when you go to a certain space on the board, you're gonna have someone open up the book and read a little paragraph and give you decisions. But the thing about that game that always stands out the most when you're playing it is that it is really a heavy engine builder. There's these artifact cards that you can acquire during the game, and you can build them. And every one that you build has some little symbols on it, and it makes you stronger. It makes you either your characters can fight better, they can travel further, there's some different skill checks in the game that they give you benefits for. And you'll end up by the end of the game with 5, 7, 10 of these cards out on the board, and they've just given you all these abilities. And it gets a little bit complex at the end because you've got to, on the last turn, you got to do a skill check. Oh wait, I've got 3 symbols here, 3 here. This one gives me something extra when I do this thing. So it's a whole bunch of stuff to track. But it's a really fun way to build up. And they've managed to do all these cards you can build up. And it's like 4 or 5 symbols and then occasional text that you have to read. So it's not that hard. You also have these adventures you can hire from the tavern when you're in the city. You can hire these little adventures. And each of them has some different icons on them. So the game really does, you feel completely different. The first turn, you can't go more than a couple spaces when you leave the city. By the end of the game, you can take like 5 turns, do 2 camps, beat a monster that's got 20 power. It's like a completely different game by the end. So that's a game that I've had a lot of fun with, really enjoyed. And I think a lot of people think of it as it's a storybook game or it's just an adventure game. To me, it's a really strong engine building game that has a lot of thematic elements tied into it that I really like. The last one that I'm going to mention is Gaia Project. Gaia Project was an interesting example because Gaia Project actually goes against some of the other things that I find fun in games. And so, specifically, like, it's not generally a tactical puzzle. That game is full open information. Once you start the game, you kind of know what's going to happen throughout it. So from that aspect, it doesn't really meet my first definition of fun. But I love that as you're building up, you've got more production throughout the game. You've got new technologies you've unlocked. It's just a great engine builder. You really do feel more powerful. Your last turn, you're going to be able to do a lot more than you could in earlier games, and I love the way it develops. What about you guys? I think, Adam, you've even mentioned you like engine building a lot in the past. So I was kind of surprised that this didn't show up on your list, but Do you guys find that that's, something that's important to you, or just something that works once in a while?
If it's done right, I really like. It's part of the crescendoing game. I think
Yeah,
I kind
that's
of
true.
loop that in there. A
Yep.
game that builds up and it starts off with some jabs here and there, and then builds up where you feel super powerful at the end. It's something like a Gaia project. It doesn't necessarily. I always feel like for each part of your engine that you build, you're destroying some part of it when you have to put a piece back. So that part is kind of frustrating to me. So, so I like it to a point, and I think Terraforming Mars does it right, and then Dune Imperium. I like that kind of the deck building thing is almost like an engine buildery kind of feel to me.
Yeah, deck builders are an excellent example of engine building, I think. Probably the best pure example, because essentially every turn, or, typically in a deck builder, every turn you're buying a card or buying a couple of cards, so that after you shuffle your deck, you're almost definitely going to have a stronger hand the next time, right? And I love that.
I want to talk about this Star Realms game Chris and I had tonight. I think, at one point we were up at, I had like 83 health, and Chris was up at like in the 70s health. And I think by the end of the game, I had gotten rid of my entire starting deck. We all had
Yeah.
8 or 9 bases. My final play, I had 8 bases over on the left, and I was able to play in the teens of cards out, and I had to get 50 something attack points to take Chris out. This game lasted like, if we were playing live, half an hour, 45 minutes for a game that's typically 10 minutes.
Yeah. That must have been, you must have had a bunch of the expansions in there.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We played with a bunch of the expansions. There was one where literally either of us could have won it based on the next draw. He drew a bunch of bases that I couldn't get through, and I had a whole handful of yellow cards that would have made him discard his whole hand if I'd gotten to the next round. But I just in that one. But man, that was intense. I had no idea that was going to come out until the last turn.
Yeah, so there's one thing I wanted to call out. So we kind of went through our list of what we find fun in games. Obviously, there's a lot of other things we find fun, but I think it's kind of cool because it gives you an idea of why do we pick the games we do. What are the games that we like more? And it'll be interesting to hear you guys vocalize what you find fun in games to see how that translates into future plays. Are there going to be more exceptions that you find that you still really enjoy, but it doesn't meet those categories? There was one kind of common thread. I mentioned it a couple times. It's really important to me that everybody at the table is having fun. Maybe I don't. It doesn't always come across that way. I joke. I don't think it comes across as joking sometimes when I'm swearing at you guys for attacking me, or when I'm like, haha, I just got you. I'm trying to be playful and kind of kid around, but I really do care that everyone's having fun. If I'm sitting there playing a game and I can tell someone's checked out, if I can tell somebody's just not enjoying themselves, that just ruins the experience for me. So I was looking at the things that I like about games, but I do think that these things also help new players get in and enjoy a game, or less experienced players, or somebody that doesn't know the game as well as I do, or wouldn't normally be as competitive. I think the fact that if there's an evolving puzzle in there, everyone's got a chance to kind of try to figure that out. An experienced player can't script out the whole game and know exactly what the right strategy is. Games that have player interaction, but someone isn't being targeted, I think that's good for new players. They get those exciting moments, but they don't feel like, hey, you just stopped my whole strategy. Now, why did I bother doing this stuff? The engine building, everybody feels like they got to accomplish something, So I think those are some of the reasons why I find those fun. They make them fun for me, but I think I always just generally have a better experience when everybody else is also enjoying the games.
And I mentioned this earlier, Tim. We were talking about it. The game group, the group that we have, makes board gaming fun. You could put the ugliest, worst gameplay game out there, and I think with the 4 of us plus whoever else, and we would just have fun with it, whether it's talking like how bad it is. I think there's something to be said for the chemistry of the game group too. I think that sounds like kind of fun to me. Let's buy some horrible game and play it and just rip on it the whole time. That sounds like a good time. The game group too makes a huge difference for any board game you put out there.
Yeah, 100%.
Hey, maybe our bottom 5 games should be our
There
next.
you go.
Chris, did you have any final thoughts? Anything else you wanted to add in?
No, I mean, it was fun thinking through this. I really enjoyed doing that, and
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of went into it knowing that it was going to have a lot to do with theme, because that's kind of what I'm into. But it was really interesting, kind of drilling down a little bit into what are the pieces of that, what makes that work, and what's fun about that. So I thought that was a great idea.
I agree. It was fun for me to try to pinpoint, to put some thought into what makes a board game fun for me and what do I actually enjoy about it. So I think this was a kind of a fun exercise.
Right on. All right, guys. Well, thanks. That was a great conversation. It was fun hearing what you guys were thinking about through this topic. I think that'll wrap up our episode. If you're a new listener to the show, go back and check out some of our other episodes. Generally, what we do is we play a board game and we immediately sit down and just have a conversation about it, talk through it, see if it helps you find some games that you like. Otherwise, I would love to hear from you on social media. And until next week, take care, everybody.
Guys.
Bye-bye.